On Christmas Day 1914, British and German soldiers who'd been trying to kill each other for months climbed out of their trenches, met in no man's land, and played football together. This wasn't a ceasefire ordered by generals. No official truce existed. These men defied their commanders, crossed a battlefield littered with corpses, and chose humanity over war. But this wasn't supposed to be possible. By December 1914, the Western Front had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, and the war everyone thought would end by Christmas had become an industrial slaughter. Which makes what happened next even more impossible. On that frozen Christmas morning, the deadliest war in human history paused, and men who spoke different languages kicked a ball across the same mud where their friends had died. To understand how extraordinary this was, you need to see what life had become. Soldiers lived in narrow mud trenches, sleeping in water, surrounded by rats and corpses, under constant threat of artillery and sniper fire. The enemy was just 50 to 100 yards away across no man's land, close enough to hear voices but transformed by propaganda into monsters. Soldiers were trained to see the other side as inhuman. The numbers tell the story. 5 months of fighting had already killed hundreds of thousands, and the killing showed no signs of stopping. Just an endless grinding of men into mud. So when Christmas Eve arrived, no one expected what came next. The German trenches began to glow with candlelight, and voices drifted across no man's land singing Stille Nacht. British soldiers stopped shooting and listened. Some recognized the melody and began singing back in English. For the first time in months, the sounds crossing the battlefield weren't bullets. They were Christmas carols. And in that moment, men on both sides realized the same truth. The enemy soldiers were singing the exact same songs their own families were singing back home that night. That realization spread like wildfire. By midnight on Christmas Eve, an unofficial ceasefire had spread along miles of the Western Front, created not by generals or treaties, but by ordinary soldiers choosing not to kill. But silence alone wasn't peace. Someone had to be first to stand up, climb over the parapet, and walk unarmed toward men who'd been trying to kill him hours before. German soldiers emerged first in some sectors, British in others. They walked slowly, hands visible, calling out greetings. The other side watched through rifle sights, fingers on triggers, deciding whether to shoot or trust. Then came the handshakes. British and German soldiers clasped hands in the crater-pocked mud, speaking broken phrases of each other's languages, laughing nervously at the absurdity of greeting someone you were supposed to kill. Gifts followed. German soldiers offered cigars and schnapps. British troops shared tea, jam, and tinned beef. They traded buttons cut from uniforms as souvenirs, physical proof that this impossible moment had actually happened. And here's where the story gets truly impossible. Someone kicked a ball onto the battlefield, and by Christmas morning, British and German soldiers were climbing out of their trenches together, not to fight, but to play. They didn't have a proper football. Some accounts say they used a tin can, others mention a bundle of rags tied with string. It didn't matter. The game was real. British Tommies faced German soldiers in a match that had no referees, no rules, and no scorekeeping. Men who had been trained to kill each other were now laughing, shouting, stumbling together in frozen mud. One British soldier later wrote that the final score was 3-2 to Germany, but the score didn't matter. The game itself was the impossible victory, humanity over war. For a few hours on Christmas Day, the war simply stopped existing as men exchanged addresses, showed photographs of families, and promised to meet again after the war. Then the sun began to set. But back in headquarters, generals on both sides saw the truce as their worst nightmare. Soldiers fraternizing with the enemy meant the war machine had lost control of its most essential component, the willingness to kill. British Field Marshal Sir John French called it a threat to discipline. German commanders issued identical warnings. If men could see their enemies as human, how could they be ordered to slaughter them tomorrow? Within days, orders went out forbidding all contact with enemy troops. Officers who had allowed the truce faced disciplinary action. Future Christmas periods would see increased artillery bombardments specifically timed to prevent any repeat of the fraternization. Here's what terrified them most. War required enemies, not neighbors. And the truce had proven that peace was always a choice, which meant soldiers might choose it again. But the next morning, whistles blew. Officers shouted orders. The same men who had sung carols together now had to pick up rifles and return to their assigned firing positions. The psychological whiplash was devastating. Men who had exchanged chocolate with German soldiers named Hans or Friedrich now received orders to aim for those same faces through their rifle sights. Some soldiers deliberately aimed high, others requested transfers. But the war machine ground forward regardless, and by January 1915, the killing resumed at full industrial scale across the entire Western Front. The war would continue for 3 more years, and many men who played football that Christmas never made it home. The truce had proved peace was possible, which is why it could never happen again. Yet the story refuses to die. Every December, we retell the Christmas Truce not because it ended the war, but because it proved something generals feared, that enemies are a fiction we choose to believe. In our world of manufactured outrage and algorithmic division, where strangers are sorted into tribes before speaking, the truce whispers a dangerous truth. Connection is always possible if we're brave enough to take the first step. Those soldiers had every reason to hate propaganda, loss, fear, orders, but on one frozen Christmas, they chose to see each other instead. That choice, made in hell, remains our most powerful argument for hope. This Christmas, when the world feels divided, remember the impossible game played in the frozen mud. If they could find humanity in hell, we can find it anywhere. What truce will you offer today?